Hello, Stillwater community. Welcome to our professional development on LGBTQ+ inclusive literature for K-12 readers, a presentation for Stillwater Public Schools. My name is Dr. Sarah Donovan, she, her pronouns. I am assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in English education.
And my name is Adam Crawley. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am also an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University in literacy education.
In this video, we're going to offer some introductions about the framework for the LGBTQ+ book bus coming your way. We're going to offer some research about why LGBTQ+ literature is important, and we're going to share some of the titles that are going to be on the book bus.
So let's give you some context first about why we're doing this project and how it came about and why these books are on the book bus. So many of you watching might be familiar with the Stillwater Public Education Foundation, or SPEF for short. And SPEF, one of the things that they do, one of the many things they do, is that they offer grants for local teachers in the school district to be able to purchase materials for their classrooms or to have certain activities in their classrooms or in their schools. And so there is this grant program. So knowing about the Stillwater Public Education Foundation grants, we worked with Christy Self, who is a teacher at Stillwater High School. She is also the coordinator for the Genders and Sexuality Alliance, the GSA club there at Stillwater High School, to create a grant proposal for the Stillwater Education Foundation. And the purpose of the grant, or what we started creating with this grant, was to add LGBTQ+ inclusive books on the Stillwater book bus. And if you're not familiar with the book bus, we'll talk more about what it is later in this session. But before we even get into more specifics about the book bus, or before we get into more specifics about why LGBTQ+ literature, maybe you'd like to know more about who we are and what brings us to this work. So again, my name is Adam Crawley, and I've got a couple of photos of myself here, both as a child and whenever I was a classroom teacher. So I identify as gay, and I have been gay for as long as I can remember. I didn't always have a word for it when I was growing up, but I always knew that my attraction was different from what it seemed like a lot of my peers were attracted to. You know, when we would have conversations on the playground, or when I would hear conversations at the lunch table, I always felt like I was different than a lot of my peers in terms of who we were attracted to. And that felt very isolating to me as a child. I felt very different. It was something I felt like I could never talk about. I didn't really ever see reflections of myself in books or on TV or in movies or anything. Now, I was a child of the 80s and the 90s, so things were a little bit different back then, but research shows us that in a lot of schools and a lot of communities, still, even in the 2010s and the 2020s, that youth have these same kind of experiences where they don't see representation of themselves. So I come to this project with that background. And then eventually, when I became an adult, I became a classroom teacher. I was an elementary teacher for 12 years, was closeted during most of that time as an elementary teacher. And again, just like I had experienced as a child, I perpetuated that by not having these books in my classroom for a variety of reasons. A lot of that had to do with my own fear and vulnerability, being a gay man who was also an elementary classroom teacher. But I also know that by not having those books in my classroom and not fostering conversations around those books, I was doing a disservice not only to myself, but also to the students who I was teaching. So those experiences as a child and a classroom teacher are really what bring me to this work now, and thinking about how can we be inclusive and how can we connect all kids with books so they can see the different ways of being in this world. And Sarah, you want to share about yourself?
Yeah, so here's a picture of my family growing up in suburb of Chicago. I'm the one all the way at the end in the red. And if you can do the math, you can count how many are there. And there's two that weren't quite born yet when this picture was taken. So I come from a family of 11. We are a family of immigrants from Italy and grew up in Chicago in a very strong Catholic family. And I come to this because I am a straight woman And I had been able to see myself and my stories in the classroom, thinking just about Romeo and Juliet and the romance, and the books in the classrooms really reflected my life, but they didn't reflect everybody's life in my family. And so my sisters, two of my sisters, grew up never having seen a mirror for themselves in the books that we were reading in school, and never had a chance to be openly talk about who they loved and who they had a crush on and who they cared about. And I think like this, so I come to this as an ally, and I'm actually trying to be a co-conspirator as I'm trying to push forth this, this vision of seeing a variety of representations in all the books that we have, from kindergarten all the way through college, and so that we all feel that we can see ourselves in the book. So I'm also was a junior high teacher in Chicago for 20 years. And so my mission has been to really diversify the text that we have in the classroom. And so I'm a big reader and looking for all the right books so we can put the right book into the right hands at the right time for all of our students. So we're happy to be a part of this project.
Sarah, you used the word mirror a few moments ago.
I did.
Connect perfectly to what I wanted to share with you all next was this concept of books as windows and mirrors. You're going to probably hear us use this phrase a lot during the next several slides. So to give you some background on this windows and mirrors concept, this comes from a woman named Rudine Sims Bishop. She was a professor at Ohio State University, and she originally used this phrase of books as windows and mirrors back in the early 1990s. And rather than me tell you what books as windows and mirrors are, I'm going to have this video from Rudine Sims Bishop share, so you actually hear it from her voice and in her words.
We need diverse books because we need books in which children can find themselves, see reflections of themselves. I wrote a piece, maybe 1990 it was published, which I called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors. And I think that's really why children need to see themselves reflected, but books can also be windows, and so you can look through and see other worlds and see how they match up or don't match up to your own. But the sliding glass door allows you to enter that world as well. And so that's the reason that the diversity needs to go both ways. I mean, it's not just children who have been underrepresented and marginalized who need these books. It's also the children who always find their mirrors in the books and therefore get an exaggerated sense of their own self-worth and a false sense of what the world is like, because it's becoming more and more colorful and diverse as time goes on. So I think that's why.
So I really appreciate what Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop shares here, and I think it connects so nicely too to what Sarah just shared a few moments ago about her own experience growing up, where Sarah talked about seeing lots of mirrors, lots of reflections of herself, maybe even getting an exaggerated sense of self, right? Because of all the representations, all the mirrors that she saw, but not very many windows. And then I, on the other hand, saw lots of windows, especially when it came to sexual orientation, but not so many mirrors. Now, Rudine Sims Bishop, in her work, when she created this windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors metaphor, it was largely focused on representations of race and ethnicity, but this same metaphor has been used in a lot of scholarly work and other work to talk about other types of representation, whether that be disability, or whether that be religion, or whether that be language, people who speak other languages other than English. And we're using it in this presentation to talk about LGBTQ plus representation. One other thing I'd like to say here before we move on to talk about the graph that we see on the right is that you will have access to these slides through the Stillwater Public Schools website or another portal, which will be shared with you. So this video that I just showed you, sometimes you're going to see some hyperlinks throughout the video. You will have access to these through the slides as well. Okay. So going back to this concept of windows and mirrors and why these books matter, this graph that's on the right, this was done by the Pew Research Center, and it was a study of LGBTQ adults and asking at what point in their life did they feel like they were other than heterosexual or other than straight, so it was asking adults to reflect back on their adolescence and reflect back on their childhood and talk about at what point did they think they might be something other than heterosexual or straight. And you can see that the median age here was 12 years old, but there were people who responded knowing this about themselves even younger, even as young as like maybe 4 or 5 years old. And I know that this was certainly the case for me as well. I remember thinking that I was different easily, around 5 or 6 years old. So sometimes conversations will come up. People will ask, is this really an appropriate topic for kids to talk about or to think about? But this graph so nicely shows that this is already a topic that people are thinking about. People are already cognizant of their sexuality in their lives from a very young age. So it most definitely is something to talk about and to have representations of from the earliest ages, especially when you think about how many heterosexual representations we have out there through the use of fairy tales like Snow White or Cinderella that we share with youth from a very young age that show representations of heterosexuality, right? So a few more graphs for you. I promise we won't share too many graphs, but looking at some of this data can be really helpful. So another reason why this work matters and having LGBTQ representations matters is because not only do children identify as something other than straight or heterosexual or aligned with the gender they were assigned at birth from a very young age, but children also experience discrimination based on their actual or perceived LGBTQ plus identity. Okay, so here we can see, and these two charts at the top are actually from Oklahoma specifically. This is research that's done by an organization called GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, GLSEN. And they do studies where they survey youth across the US, and then they report on the findings. And so of the youth that they surveyed, 96%, this comes from 2019, this is their most recent study, 96% of the youth reported hearing gay being used in a negative way, okay? 86% of the youth reported hearing homophobic remarks or negative remarks about gender expression. 81% heard negative remarks about transgender people. And then if you look at this graph here to the right, this shows the different types of harassment that students have experienced based on sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender. And the lighter brown is for verbal harassment. This kind of darker brown is for physical harassment, and the gray is for physical assault. So we can see the amount of harassment that's taking place, again, based on actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender expression or gender identity. But research has also shown that there is a correlation between having inclusive text and supportive teachers and having lower harassment and lower derogatory marks, verbal harassment, physical harassment. So the more inclusive we are, the more resources we provide youth, the more equitable and just and welcoming of learning environments it creates. And I wanted to share this one more slide with you with a few more graphs and charts to show some data over time. So GLSEN, that organization I just spoke about a few moments ago, they do this survey every 2 years. And so I just showed you the 2019 graphs a moment ago, but I also wanted to show you the 2017 graphs to show that in some situations, the harassment has even gotten worse over time. Okay, so for example, in 2017, 94% of students reported hearing gay used in a negative way, but in their most recent survey in 2019, that number had jumped up to 96. Okay, if you look at negative remarks about transgender people, in 2017, 75% of youth reported hearing those types of remarks. And in 2019, that jumped up to 81%. So over 5% of an increase, even in just 2 years. So this really shows the need for us as educators and us as other adults working with youth to really do what we can to create more inclusive spaces. Some numbers went down, but not by much. You know, we went from 87% to 86%. So that was not much of a change, but definitely work to be done. Sarah, I think that so nicely ties into what you're going to talk about now. So let's go for it.
Yes, thank you so much, Adam. I think it's really important to think about those numbers and that things don't just change on their own. You know, that it takes direct decisions and being really intentional about the choices that we make and the way that we create our libraries and create our classroom and create our curriculum. And so we're going to be really intentional right now and talk about what LGBTQ plus really stands for and how to understand the letters. And so you can see the letters and you can see the colors behind it, the rainbow. And we're going to just talk a little bit about that so that we can be on the same page moving forward. So I'm going to talk just about the first letter. So LGBTQ plus is an umbrella. It's intended to be a unifying umbrella term, though each letter does represent something slightly different, sort of a subset of the larger group. So the L stands for lesbian, and it's meaning a woman who is sexually or emotionally attracted to other women, though some women personally prefer to use the term gay.
And speaking of G for gay, this is a term that is often used to refer to a man who is physically and or emotionally attracted to other men. But again, just like Sarah said with L for lesbian, not all people identify using the term gay either. There are some people in the community who might say they are men loving other men. Okay, as opposed to being gay. There are many different terms within the LGBTQ plus community, and that's part of what the plus helps to represent. It's just that broadening of the terms, the broadening of the scope, and we'll talk more about that in a little while. Sarah, you want to talk about the B?
The B stands for bisexual, and that's people who identify as bisexual are sexually and or emotionally, and I keep mentioning that other part because it can just be affection or emotionally attracted to both men and women or to more than one gender identity.
All right. And then the T stands for transgender. And this is a term that I know some people are very familiar with, some people not as much. So I want to give a little context for this. So a transgender person is a person who identifies as a gender that is different from the gender they were assigned at birth. Okay. So for example, when someone is born and a doctor assigns them as a boy or a girl, okay, that is a gender that is being assigned onto that person based on their physical genitalia, okay? However, there are people who identify as they continue through their childhood and through adolescence, people who identify different from that gender that was assigned to them, okay? And so if they were assigned as a boy at birth, but they might identify or feel like they are a girl, that person may be transgender. Now, transgender people will sometimes disclose their gender to other people, you know, either by coming out and sharing that with other people. Maybe they will disclose it through their clothing that they wear or how they present themselves, you know, in terms of their hair, other ways that they physically present themselves, but not always. There are some transgender people who have that gender identity that they feel, but they don't necessarily share that publicly, okay? Or they might not be ready to share that publicly yet, but maybe they want to at some point. It's also really important to know that not all transgender people go through surgery or take hormones, okay, to physically change their body to align with their gender. Some people do, but not all do, okay? That's really important to know. The other thing I wanted to say about transgender is that it's really important to know that there is a difference between sex and gender, okay? And this is something that I continue to work on myself as well. When we use terms like male or female, that is referring to a person's sex. That is referring to their physical anatomy. When we are talking about gender, we need to use terms like man or woman or boy or girl, because that isn't necessarily aligned with their physical anatomy. That is aligned with the feeling they have about their gender. Okay, and that is a different thing. Okay. There is also a term that you don't see here in the letters that I want to share with you, since we're talking about gender and transgender right now, and that is the word cisgender. Okay, now cisgender are people like me who was assigned boy at birth, and I identify as a boy, or I identify now as a man, right? And so my gender aligns with what I was assigned at birth, and I present myself as a man publicly. Okay, so there is that term cisgender as well. Whew, there's a lot of terminology,
There's a
isn't
lot
there,
there.
Sarah? And
But I
another,
think that's why we use our pronouns, we use our pronouns in our names so that people don't have to make assumptions about that. We can tell you in our name when we put our pronouns next to us how we identify, and so you don't have to guess.
and speaking of assumptions, that's part of the reason why we're wanting to go through each of these letters individually right now, is because we don't want to assume that you as the viewer automatically know what these terms are or know the context behind all these terms. You might not. So we are also trying to be very careful on not operating on assumptions. All right, Sarah, I know the term Q, or the letter Q for queer, often has a lot of assumptions that come with it. You want to talk about that letter?
Yes, and feel free to jump in if you want to add anything on that. So Q can stand for two things. So one of them being queer, and in the past, the word queer was used as sort of a discriminatory slur. But the term has been reclaimed by the LGBTQ plus community, and queer is often used as a broad term for anyone who's not straight and not cisgender. So cisgender people are those, as Dr. Crawley was saying, have a gender identity and expression that matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. Although some people proudly identify as queer, some LGBTQ plus people still find the term queer offensive. And so it's just helpful to be aware of the historical context of that. The other way the Q might be used is as questioning. And so questioning refers to someone questioning their sexual orientation and or their gender identity. So they're not quite sure how to identify themselves. And sometimes that's partially because we've created this binary of one or the other. And there's actually quite a spectrum. And so trying to find the right way that you want to identify yourself that feels comfortable for you is for the person to decide.
And then you also have the plus here at the end. And as you might be aware, there are other letters that are sometimes added to this acronym. Sometimes you might see LGBTQIA, or you might see LGBTQIA2S. Okay, there's many different letters that are sometimes added. So this plus is to be inclusive of those different letters, okay, or those different identities, I should say. For example, there is the intersex community, and not going to give a whole lot of information right now about intersex. One, because we don't want to share inaccurate information, but also we know that you might want to explore some of this more fully on your own. But in short, intersex people are those who are born with both male and female genitalia, or male and female chromosomes, and that a lot of times doctors will make decisions at birth. If there are both types of genitalia there, they will actually do a surgery that will assign a sex to that child, removing that other form of genitalia. And a lot of times people grow up not knowing this about themselves, but they know there's something, they feel there's something different about themselves. And then they later come to discover that they were actually born intersex. And so they find a sense of community. So again, there is the intersex community. There's the asexual community. There's 2S, which is two-spirit. So in some indigenous communities, these would be people who identify as both a man and a woman simultaneously, or even more genders. It doesn't always have to be a binary. So those are just a few of the different ways that people might also identify in the LGBTQ plus community. And we were very intentional about the background that we chose here, not only for it to be the rainbow colors, like you see with the rainbow flag, but also because you can see the overlap in the shading here, kind of where the yellow runs into the green and the green runs into the blue and the purple. Because just like what you see with the colors here and those overlaps in the shading, there's a lot of overlaps here in people's identities or the ways they refer to themselves. Okay, these are not just very strict, kind of clear-cut identity groups. And one thing I also want to point out here is that the rainbow flag is sometimes also shown with brown and black in it. And we don't have that here, but the brown and the black would really pays homage and heightens that significance on people of color who are part of the LGBTQ community, who are further marginalized, not only because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, but also because of their race and because of their ethnicity, and experience increased marginalization because of that. So just to give you some insight too about the brown and the black that you might sometimes see in the rainbow flag. And I know Sarah's going to talk even more about those different layers of people's identities in a few moments.
All right, so when we're talking about LGBTQ plus literature and the books that are going to be coming your way, it's helpful to think about what representations are you going to find in these books that we're offering you and that are going to be driving into your community. So what can you expect? You can expect love. Love. Yes, you can expect love between two people. You can expect stories about how families came to be. You can expect everyday stories about families. You can expect family diversity, inclusive communities. You can expect some stories of harm or some stories of like AIDS and HIV representation and the historical context of LGBTQ plus communities. That's going to be there, yes. And even some adversity or anxiety about LGBTQ plus identity. That's going to be there too. And there's going to be stories of advocacy and activism and stories of coming out. So some of the things that you expect, but there's also going to be some of the things that is in every book that we want to see in the hands of our students and our children. Friendship, being a kid, growing up, coming of age, sports, joy, grief, loss, belonging, fitting in, neighborhoods and place, and just so much more of just what it means to be a human being growing up and trying to navigate our way in this world. And these books that you're gonna see also stretch the span of our life, from stories of being young and stories of being in middle school and stories of being in high school, so that all along the way we can see windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors and curtains, as Debbie Reese calls them, to follow us along our lifeline. So those are really important things to think about too. And the other thing that you're going to find in these books, and you're going to see once we show you the covers, which are beautiful, is you're going to see intersectionality. And this comes from Kimberly Crenshaw's work, who talks about how rich and beautiful like our lives are, because it's not just one or, but it's and really inclusive. And so you can see the rainbow here again, but you can also see all the different ways these are called intersections of gender and sexuality with religion, with ethnicity, with age, with disability, race, education, class, culture, place, geography, because everyone's experience is slightly different as these intersections, in these places where they're crossing. And you can see that there's so many places where it does. And that's what makes every story really unique, depending on where it's set or who are the people or what relationships are being established there. And so there isn't just one story of LGBTQ+, there's many stories. And so thinking about this intersectionality gives you a range to explore when you're picking up those books and thinking about what intersections do I want to explore and see, and what stories do I want to enjoy.
And two, to follow up on this idea of intersectionality before we move on, it is also brings to our awareness aspects of privilege, right, and marginalization. So to know that some people's experiences are more challenging than others because of their multi identities or overlapping and layered identities. So for example, I know as a white male cisgender person, I have a lot of privilege in my life that even though I'm gay, those other parts of my identity provide me access or provide me privilege in ways that other people don't have, maybe because of their skin color, or maybe because they are transgender, or because of other aspects of their identity. Okay, so that's a lot of what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in her work too, is not only how rich and how nuanced and how different each of our experiences are, but also how our different identities afford us privilege or marginalize us in different ways too. So now, really bringing it back to Stillwater, because we've shared a lot of theory with you. Now let's bring it home. Let's bring it right here to Stillwater. As you likely know, there is this wonderful resource that the community has. It's called the Book Bus, and it has been around for several years. I'm not sure of the whole history, but I know it's been around for a while. And my goodness, especially during this pandemic, what a resource it has been, because it was a way to connect kids with books when schools were closed, or even when physical libraries were harder to access, right? It was still a way for this book bus to go out in the community to be able to connect kids with books. And the book bus has a traveling schedule. I've got an example here on the slide, so you can see, like, sometimes it's at the Boomer Lake Playground, sometimes it's at Strickland Park, sometimes it's at different apartment complexes. We're not sure that this is going to be the schedule for this summer, okay, but you can check out the Stillwater Public Schools website, and they will have the book bus schedule, the current book bus schedule, available when it's ready for this summer. So be sure to watch out for that. But just know that this book bus is available. It has tons of books on it of all types, and we are just adding to that collection. So now we're going to share with you about some of the books that we've been able to work with the GSA and Christy Self at Stillwater High School to be able to add to the book bus. But before we even get into that, Sarah, do you want to talk about how we even selected these books?
Yes. Okay. So as I told you, I was a junior high teacher before I came to Oklahoma State, and we had a great classroom library, but I felt like it was really important to read all the books before I was putting them into the hands of the students. So I was reading a book a day, over 300 books in a year. So where did I find all these books? Well, the Rainbow Book List was one of the places that I would go to, and I would see the books that are being recommended there, and then I would read those books. Also, the Stonewall Book Award, like, you can go there and you can see even more titles than the ones that are going to be on the book bus. But that book award is really prestigious because they've done a lot of reading, and these are the books that they're going to represent because they have inclusive, affirming representations of LGBTQ plus people. Also, Reading the Rainbow is a fantastic book for educators and for families, but this is a great book that talks about ways that you can include these books into your curriculum, into your classroom. And queer adolescent literature, this is for middle and more high school teachers, chapters full of how to pair some of the books that you might also already be reading in your classroom with some of the LGBTQ plus books as well. And Dr. Crawley and I wrote this lovely article about how to share these books across the lifeline of our students as well. And so all these places, plus our collaboration with Stillwater High School's Gender and Sexuality Alliance, we sifted through some of our favorite books and put together, well, we have so many favorites, but we put together like some of our favorites for you to be on the bus.
And before we go on and actually start showing you some of those books, just to point out here, both with the Stonewall Book Award and with the Rainbow Book List, you can see here at the top it says American Library Association. So both the Stonewall Award and the Rainbow Book List are put together by the American Library Association, which does such important work in terms of acknowledging books and helping to raise awareness about certain books, but also really combating censorship, right, and book banning. The American Library Association is all about providing access for all.
Yeah.
So we've been so excited to share these books with you. So now we're going to do a little bit of that. But I will tell you, we're not going to speak about each of these books individually or give you a whole lot of information right now, because Christy Self and members of the GSA, that Genders and Sexualities Alliance from the high school, and maybe a few other teachers or community members are going to be making specific videos about different books and providing book talks where they talk about some of these books and provide you even more information and provide summaries and their own personal thoughts about these books. And those will also be available to you through the Stillwater Public Schools website or through other resources. So you'll need to stay tuned for those videos. But we're just going to give you kind of an overview of the books that have been added. So these are ones that are being added that are kind of geared toward the elementary age, although I'm a big advocate that books should be read across people's lives. So even if something's a picture book, doesn't mean that it couldn't be readily enjoyed by a middle school or high school student either, right? But some of these books, as you can see, we have picture books, like When Aiden Became a Brother and Tango Makes Three, This Day in June, which is about a pride parade, When We Love Someone, We Sing to Them, Prince and Knight, Pride, all of these at the top are picture books. And then these four at the bottom are chapter books for slightly older elementary students or even getting in the middle grades. The Best Man by Richard Peck, After Two Back and D. Foster by Jacqueline Woodson, Better Nathan Ever by Tim Federle, and The Cardboard Kingdom, which is a graphic novel by Chad Sell. And one thing I really want to point out before Sarah talks about the middle school and high school books, we've tried to be very intentional about making sure, going back to this idea of intersectionality, that we have different types of representations, okay? We have different representations in terms of genre, okay? Like we have some biographies, we have some fantasy, kind of fairy tales, okay? We have some realistic fiction, like things that could happen in real life, but haven't really. We have different types of characterization. We've got animal characters, we've got human characters, right? And we have different representations when it comes to like race or ethnicity, other ways of being. So like when we see When Aiden Became a Brother, we see people of color, right? Here, When We Love Someone, We Sing to Them. Not only do we have people of color, but it's a bilingual text. So important to see that language diversity. And we also have been really attentive to authorship as well, thinking about who are these books written by? Are they members of the community that they're writing about? Jacqueline Woodson is a phenomenal author, African-American, identifies as lesbian and queer, and so her work is so important, and we see a really important queer representation here in After Tupac and D. Foster. So just to give you a little bit of insight too about some of these books. All right, Sarah, I know there's a lot here for middle school and high school, so go for it.
Yeah, there is a lot here. And so I'll also echo what Dr. Crawley was saying, that the covers of the books are really important. And as far as your initial sort of reading of the intersectionality of the books, you can see the beautiful representations here. And also I'll note that, as Dr. Crawley said, we're also thinking about the authors here. And there's this, it's called #OwnVoices, where the author of the books identifies with similarly as the main characters or some of the characters in the book sometimes. But it is really important for me to look at the author's note and to hear how the author prepared to write the story and the author's sort of intentions behind it. So I love that part of the books for sure. But you can see each one of these books is kind of focuses on a different letter of the LGBTQ+. And so when we talked about the Q, Mighty Heart of Sunny St. James, this is about a main character who's just sort of starting to have the feels for another girl and just doesn't kind of know what that means yet. And so that's sort of the questioning at the beginning, and that you can kind of think about how the Q looks in the story. And it's a lovely story of just having a crush. Don't you remember what that felt like? Kaysen Callender is a fantastic author, and you'll see two books by Kaysen Callender here, Hurricane Child and King and the Dragonflies. You see that gold sticker on King and the Dragonflies. That's because it's a National Book Award winner. And This book is also set in the South, in Louisiana as well. So you can get a sense of what it's like to live in a different part of the country if you haven't been to Louisiana. You can also see some of these books. You can't tell at the top in the cover, but there's a sense that it might be, yes, that's right, graphic novels. So drama is a graphic novel. So if you love graphic novels and comics, that is going to be a great book for you there too. And so, and sports related, as we already talked about, like, you know, some of the books are about love and some of the books are about family and some of the books are about grief. Some of the books are about sports, and you can see the Derby Daredevils is a fantastic one too. So lots of fun with that middle grade book. So all these are middle grade books that you should take a look and read as many as you can get your hands on. So let's look at the high school. Okay, so here's a few for, these are called young adult. Young adult novels are typically novels that are from sort of 9th grade to 12th grade. It's helpful to think about a good fit for you sometimes might be a book that has a main character about the same age as you when you're thinking about high school, maybe a little bit older, imagining what it's like to grow up into that age a little bit. So the content of these might just be a little bit more mature, or yeah, a little bit more mature for the upper elementary or middle school students. So it's important, I think, for teachers to read the books also before you kind of hand them to your students, or to be open to having conversations with their students about the books that they're reading. So Clap When You Land is a fantastic verse novel. That's right, verse, poetry. April is National Poetry Month, in case you didn't know, but Clap When You Land is a novel in verse. So it's a story of poetry that all together tells a narrative. And this is a book that is set in New York and then also in the Dominican Republic. I'll give you the sun. You can see there's that sticker. You see the sticker? That's a book award from the Stonewall Book Award. Fantastic story that alternates narrators. So it has a dual narrator. And Pet, look at all the stickers on Pet, because it's also an award-winning book. This is a speculative fiction book. So it kind of takes place in an alternate universe, sort of, where there's no pain, where there's no hate, right? Imagine that. And it kind of takes place into this one story where Jam, who is the main character, who is trans, but it's a place where trans is accepted and it's normalized, and it's not even a main thread in the narration too. So that's kind of showing the intersectionality of time and space and genre as well. So great. As you can see, so many stickers on all these other books. So they're well read and well loved for you to check out for your students and for yourself.
And one thing that we really want to emphasize is that these are certainly not the only LGBTQ plus book that exists, right? These are a sampling, but they'll be what exists on the book bus for now, right? And the hope is that more books will be added in the future as well. We are so very grateful to the Stillwater Public Education Foundation for funding this grant and to being able to provide these books that, again, have been curated by Dr. Donovan and myself, along with the students in the GSA at Stillwater High School, to be on this list. And one other thing I wanted to share with you too is that for those of you who are looking at these book titles, maybe for many of you, these are all new. But for some of you, you might be watching this video thinking, I've heard of this book before. I've heard of that book before. Like Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. That book has been around for a while. And like Lillian Duncan has been around for a while. And like And Tango Makes Three, I think has recently celebrated I think 2015 was its 10-year anniversary, right? So I mean, this book is now 15 or 16 years old. So it's hard to believe that some of these books have been around for that long. And then some of these books have been published just in the past, year or two. So we were also trying to be very attentive to picking what we felt like were some of the best, but also showcased some of the history of even these books over time as well and what's available. So in closing, just like Dr. Donovan shared a few moments ago, we want to encourage you to not just read one of these books, but read as many of them as you can. Read all of them that you can. And the reason for doing that is because we all need, no matter how we identify, we all need windows and we all need mirrors. And the more representations that we see, the more it will develop our understanding and our empathy for others. There's a great TED Talk that we're not going to watch right now due to time, but you will have the link to this to be able to watch in the slides. But it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And this is by a Nigerian storyteller. Her name is Chiamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she's not talking about LGBTQ plus topics in this TED Talk, but a lot of what she shares really connects with what we're sharing in this presentation, which is this importance of multiple representations. And she talks about sometimes we have stereotypes about groups of people because the information that we have about a type of person is incomplete. Okay, and having incomplete information then reinforces stereotypes. But the more that we read and the more that we see different types of representations, the fuller picture and the more nuanced picture we can get. There's not just one way to be gay. There's not just one way to be trans. There's not one experience that is true of all bisexual people, right? We need to see those different representations. And so really encourage you to watch that TED Talk when you get a chance. And in fact, let me still pause it because it was about to show the video to you. But we just want to close out by saying thank you so much for your time watching this video, thinking about what books you want to look for on the book bus when it rolls your way. We encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or if we may be of further support. Again, we want to also encourage you to be on the lookout for those book talk videos that are going to be created by students and other community members that showcase more about those individual books. So again, thank you for your time.